My secret, just do something that ain't nobody ever done before, but make it sound like something that's always been there forever.
Hello, welcome to This Filipino American Life, a podcast that explores the nuanced experiences of Filipinos in the United States at iba pa. My name is Joe Bernardo, and I'm joined by my fellow hosts,
Ryan Carpio,
Elaine Delales, and
Mike.
Oh my God,
producer Mike.
who is eating?
Who's eating?
I'm eating right now, sorry.
You know that people don't like it if you eat on mic, right? Because there's issues. There's like a thing. Oh. I could do that
But
instead of.
it's good food though, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because I cooked it. So, do we have a TFAL of the episode, Elaine?
Yes, the TFAL of the episode is Caroline Calderon.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say it. I'm not
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thank
Caroline.
You really did that?
Sorry.
So, in this episode, we're going to talk about panethnic identity.
What?
Panethnic identity.
Panethnic?
Panethnic identity.
Pan as in bread? Sorry.
We're talking about ethnic
Pan-ethnic.
bread?
Deseo.
Pan like tipal pan?
Yeah.
Pan delicious?
Are you pan de sal, pan de ube, pan de coco?
leche.
Pan de coco, pan de leche.
Very punny. So yes, panethnic identity, meaning Asian American, Latino, African American,
Wow.
all those different kind of
Latinx.
Latinx, Africanix. No, that's
No,
not
it's
one.
not a thing.
No,
That's
no.
not a
Philippines.
thing.
Philip Banks.
Philippines.
Oh,
Philippines.
Wow. If that starts trending, Philip Banks, that's going to be awesome.
Yes. So we are gonna have Dr. Anthony Ocampo to talk about panethnic identity. Are Filipinos Asian? Are they Latino? What are we? Before we talk to Anthony, I want to get all of your opinions on the matter. So yeah, do you think Filipinos are Asian American?
What? That's loaded.
How
Good
so?
question.
I have to say, I think we talked about this in the Filipinx episode. Philippines. I never identified myself as Asian American when asked. Like, you know, if ever I was asked what are you, I would always say Filipino American. However, on paper or in like in forums and such, if there's no Filipino, I probably would check the Asian American box. I think there has been instances in the past too where I thought maybe the most accurate thing for me to check is like the Pacific Islander box when they started existing like earlier on, but I would always identify as Filipino. I don't know, just to me it was more appropriate.
Okay.
But-
Why not Asian? When growing up, at least.
I always thought of Asian as like more Chinese and maybe Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where that came from, but that's kind of like always been growing up in LA at least. I've always been kind of how I thought about it. So I never really thought of identifying any other way. At least verbally, if I was ever asked. But again, you know, if you had to fill out forms and you fill out the best description of who you are, I'd probably check the Asian American box or something like that, or Asian box.
How about you, Mike?
I think like I didn't really question any of that till college because so I grew up in Oxnard and there was a pretty appreciable Filipino community there, but also a lot of Asian Americans in general. And I remember in high school, like I was part of the Asian American Club, obviously because there wasn't like a Filipino club back then. I don't think there is one now, but it wasn't really something that I really thought that deeply about until I went to college, and then I eventually became an Asian American Studies major and started studying literally. I think there was a class called like Panethnic Identity, and kind of how it all fits together, and not really wrestling with the fact that there is a distinction or there is enough of a experiential difference to even think that there would be like, you know, I would fit in any other category. I mean, at first, like a lot, the Asian American identity, you know, that's on one level is continental, but on another level, it's about like experience, right? And it came up in the 60s to kind of solidify kind of that movement. But, you know, it wasn't until like I had to kind of like learn that history and kind of understand kind of the different nuances of that, and also starting to recognize kind of the different experiences people kind of like more like East Asian kind of, and South Asian even, like very different kind of experiences that they went through, that I even considered that I could fall anywhere else. Right. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, like if there wasn't a Filipino option, I'd usually just pick Asian in any kind of form or anything else. And never really kind of interrogated that until like way later. So, I mean, yeah, it's something that like didn't really come into play in my thought process until like there were a lot of conversations and questions about where do Filipinos fit in, and kind of like I went to UC Irvine, so you know, a school that's like largely, you know, at the time was a majority Asian American. So I think it was like something like 40-50%, but really in like real numbers it was like more like 60-70% if you think about it, depending on like how much you count like, you know, people who are like Southeast Asian and like things like that. So, you know, until I was in that kind of diversity in that space, like I was just like, oh, we're just Asian. Yeah. You know, there's no reason to question it, you know.
It's not true, I guess, right?
Yeah.
It's not true. Yeah.
Laners?
I guess it was like if I ever had to mark the box, I always picked Asian if that was listed there. And then if Filipino was there, I would pick Filipino. And I know I didn't really think about it in like elementary school or high school, but in college, I totally had that like wrestling with my identity conversation with myself.
Who am I?
Who am I?
These brown hens.
Oh, so many brown hens.
So who are you? I'm just kidding.
I don't know. No, but like when I was first to college, like I was like, oh, I'm gonna join the Filipino club, even though like I already know what it means like to be a Filipino, because I went to the Filipino school in the Valley. Like I know what I'm doing, and then you go and you're like, oh, I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't know, and then you like still join like the Asian American club and be like, I have two identities. I'm Asian American and Filipino American.
And then the rainbow
And then
kind of goes.
yeah.
The rainbow appears.
And then I'm like, oh my God, I'm so woke.
Dun, 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 dun.
And now it's just like, look, I will mark whatever's easiest at this point. Like, here.
Here's my form.
just put X at the end of it. We're good.
Yeah.
I think I always, identify as Filipino, but I think growing up where I grew up, there were a lot of there weren't too many people of color in general, and there were a lot of Asian Americans, namely Korean Americans, and I think phenotypically I look more East Asian. I have like more almond eyes, and so I guess I was affiliated more with Asian American, but then like a lot of my Korean friends will be like, why the hell you have a freaking Spanish last name, right? So then I have to explain the history, etc. And then sometimes I would get rejected. So, oh, you're not really Asian,
You're like, screw you, man.
Yeah, so that's the way kind of I identified myself growing up. And then, coming into college, I think just institutionally, the places where you found Filipinos were within these Asian American spaces, like Asian American studies.
Yeah.
The Filipino club was under kind of the umbrella group of Asian America.
What's the Filipino club at Santa Barbara?
Kapatirang Pilipino.
Wow.
Or
What?
KP.
KP.
Yeah.
Oh.
K-pop?
Kapatirang Pilipino.
Oh, wow. There's a chant?
There's always
Calm down, friendship games.
There's always a chant. You didn't have one?
I don't know. We probably did.
We did.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to go there.
So did you ever identify or have kind of more strong affiliations towards other subgroups, other pan-ethnicities like Latinos or Pacific Islanders or any other kind of type of groups?
I always would get like super upset at Filipinos who would say that they were Pacific Islanders, because they would be like, well, the Philippines isn't an island and it's in the Pacific Ocean. And I would be like, we're not Hawaiian, we're not Micronesian, we're not Macronesian, we're not like Tongan or Samoan. Like, I don't want to get lumped in with folks that I'm not, I'm not a part of that culturally. Like, why?
But we have tattoos.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's like our Japanese people, Pacific Islanders, because there are islands in the Pacific, right?
Yeah, see, like,
Taiwanese.
Yeah, Taiwanese.
Yeah.
So it almost felt like you talk about phenotype and like some Filipinos, because they're like the dark and they're brown and they're like, yo, I look like my fellow Samoan guy friends, but I'm not as huge, but we're both brown, so I'm gonna say I'm an islander. Like, that just seems wrong to me. I don't know. So that always would make me irate when I would see people do that.
But that was also like a factor of like who was around them too, right? Like if they were surrounded, like if you were like in the South Bay of Los Angeles, where there were a lot of people from Pacific Islands, from Hawaii or Samoan, like, and you're Filipino, I mean, it was probably really easy to kind of slip into that crowd and identify with that kind of culture.
Yeah. And I think that, again, it speaks to my experience, right? Like, I have no family in Hawaii. I have no connection to Hawaii whatsoever. But I do know that there are lots of Filipinos who have family in Hawaii, who are like Ilocano, and they are part of that whole sugar plantation story, right? So that's their story, and they can do it, and they can have those identifying roots. But I want to be like, hey, bro, you're not Hawaiian.
Hey, brah.
You're Filipino.
Shaka brada.
Hey, brother.
Especially those who have like no connection to Hawaii, but
no, stop.
I've been there.
because especially in the 80s, like Hawaii was more socially visible and socially acceptable, and so a lot of Filipinos gravitated towards that.
Because it was still America, and it was like,
Like, I look like them. I'm gonna,
It still is America, though.
What was that?
It still is America. Hawaii.
Yeah, this is what
Just clarify.
what did I
Like,
say?
remember when it was America?
No, I mean, I meant the I guess was when you said in the 80s, like to them it's like, oh, it's America, So there was more of an acceptance for it than saying, yeah. Anyway,
so if identity is always kind of tied to context, to where you grew up, how you grew up, who you grew up with, I know, Ryan, you grew up with a lot of Latinos in your neighborhood, in your schools. Did you have kind of a strong affiliation with Latinos, Mexicans, Salvadorans, etc.?
I would say just, I mean, we grew up in the same neighborhood, but I think in identifying myself, not necessarily. I think there was a lot of Filipinos and Latinos that I grew up with, but I hung out mostly with Filipinos. I hung out with some Latinos, but it was I never identified with them other than neighborhood wise. And also during that time too, I think especially in the 80s and 90s, there were just the existence of like this gang identity as well, and a lot of gangs were racially charged. And so, Filipinos, I'm an immigrant. My brothers were a little bit older than me, so they gravitated towards their own. We don't necessarily just because we're lived in the same neighborhood, necessarily gravitate towards like the social comfort that we would have with Filipinos with Latinos. So it was. I wouldn't say we as a family, or even me growing up, that I saw similarities that much. Maybe apart from the last names, like just being thought of as, oh, you have a Latino last name. Other than that, I really didn't. Would I say the same thing for Asian American? I didn't really hang out with any other Asian groups until probably college. And then it was kind of like what Mike was saying. It's a little bit different by the time I got to college. And high school was also hung out with a lot of Filipinos too. So
yeah.
How
about you, Mike? I know you grew up in Oxnard, and there are a lot of Mexicans and Filipinos in Oxnard. But I also remember there was like a gang war. Between Filipinos and Mexicans.
I actually lived like in the center of it, I think, because it was a pretty mixed neighborhood, and so there was a lot of Filipinos at our street, at least during the 80s and 90s. But it was also like right at the kind of the borderland of like kind of 2 or 3 rival gangs, one of them being Filipino. And so it wasn't uncommon to like, step out of my house and like see like a Filipino dude fighting with like a Mexican dude, like because they were from kind of rival gangs. And those were like, the predominant Filipino gangs at the time and the Mexican gangs just not getting along. But I mean, beyond that, like Oxnard as being a pretty diverse city, at least in my estimation, just because like, it's had a long history of kind of like, it's a farm town. So there's a lot of people who came into Oxnard to work the farms, including Japanese Americans and whatnot. And it's actually the site of the first, like, I think, cross multi-ethnic kind of
interethnic labor alliance.
It was like Japanese and Mexicans. And so like it was always interesting to me when I hear a lot of anxieties about like kind of interethnic kind of like relationships and marriage and stuff in other places in the country, because that's just kind of like normal, like, so I mean there was enough diversity that it didn't really do a lot of reflection upon my own identity and how it kind of fit in, because it was kind of like I thought of myself, if anything, as more of like someone from Oxnard who happened to be Filipino, who had friends kind of from all backgrounds, because I was kind of like, all my classmates it was a pretty diverse kind of array of folks too. And so, these were not things that I had to contend with really, at least until like maybe later in high school or into college, when it was just like understanding that in places that are less kind of blended together, that people have anxieties about like where do they fit in and how do those other people fit in relation to my kind of positionality, et cetera. Like it wasn't really something that I'd never really interrogated and understood as like an issue as much, or maybe I was just blind to it because I was also raised in the suburbs. So
How about you, Elaine? I know St. Jen's was like
We were like
half
all
Mexican,
Filipino.
half Latino, half Filipino.
Yeah. So it was kind of like you didn't have to question it. You were just like always going to be Filipino. Like,
Yeah.
you knew like I'm not Mexican, I'm not Salvadorian, I am Filipino, and there are like 50 other people who do the same thing.
Yeah.
So we didn't really have like those types of conversations, or like, but I feel like there were lines in like what was Filipino or like coded as Filipino and what was coded as not Filipino. Like you had to do certain things. Like the Filipino kids, you played basketball, but you didn't play baseball. Like that was just what it was. Or like the Filipino girls, they did drill team, which was the dancing part, but you didn't do cheer. So the Latino and white kids did cheer.
Wow.
The Latino and white kids did baseball and softball. But that was what your track was supposed to be. But then there will always be like one or two Filipinos or one or two Latino white kids who would do the inverse. So like I knew somebody who was like Filipino and he played baseball. And I would be like, what? Like a Filipino guy play baseball? Like that's not, you're supposed to be playing volleyball right now. That's like your sport that season. But he'd been playing baseball in Little League. So I'm like, okay, that makes sense. So that's where I think I saw like cultural divides or like ethnic divides in high school. But like gang wise, I don't think I ever paid attention to like Latino gangs, or I only paid attention to like who the Filipino gangs were because that's what impacted my life. Like Latino gangs, I'd be like, whatever, like I don't care about that. Because like the party crews and whatnot, like they were all Filipino anyway. So I it didn't even like if they were Mexican gangsters or Latino gangsters, I'd be like, you're just a cholo. I'm not gonna know what gang you're in. I just know you're a cholo. Like that was it. But for Filipinos, I'm like, oh, you're a part of this gang, you're a part of that. I can't talk to you here, but I can talk to you there. Like there's different rules,
Yeah. So moving forward, I know Filipinos are kind of lumped in and institutionalized as Asian American, although marginally, and yet there is still ambivalence into adopting Asian American as a pan-ethnic identity. How do you kind of navigate that in moving forward in your lives now and kind of all the organizations and institutions that we're a part of?
How do you navigate the kind of like being like?
Yeah, I mean, like, or how do you navigate? Say you're part of an institution and they talk about Asian Americans, but they never talk about Filipinos or something. We talked about that about Asian American podcasts.
Yeah,
right. So how do you navigate? And we're all kind of involved in some kind of Asian American organization.
I think like for certain things, especially like in like arts and whatnot, I tend to like look at if there's like a Asian American showcase or whatnot. I like try and see like, well, who are the brown Asians on the lineup? Like, are there Filipinos? Are there Vietnamese Americans? Are there South Asians on the lineup? Like, because otherwise I kind of will like roll my eyes at the show, because I say like it's an Asian American showcase, and then you look at the lineup and I'm like, no, it's an East Asian American showcase.
Yeah.
And so, there are times where like I don't want to feel like I'm policing it, but I feel like it just, their comments need to be said if it's a pan-ethnic identity, that those certain communities aren't included. Because like you can't like reap the benefits of like Kinjas or not Kinjas or Cabo Modern and like the fancy like Filipino dancing, but then like not have like a Filipino American band or something, you know what I mean, on the lineup, because it's like, oh, they're Asian American, and it's kind of like, yo, bro, like it's always bros. I should say something else.
I feel like I've become hyper aware of it, like the older I've gotten, and just what Lane was saying about being very kind of like skeptical and leery about like things that are presented as Asian American, but not as inclusive, you know.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think like there's this like undercurrent of feeling like an overrepresentation of like East Asians in some of those conversations and events and cultural, you know, things. It's like, just because like when I think about like, I'm a data person, and you look at the numbers, you know, like Filipinos are like one of the largest groups, and yet you don't, and this goes back to the whole visibility and cultural kind of appropriation conversations we've had in the past about like there's so many Filipinos, but you never hear about them until like certain kind of things or certain kind of events or certain cultural displays. But largely like, you know, in a city with so many Asian Americans like Los Angeles, you know, are Filipinos as visible in those spaces as they could be if you thought about like their kind of proportional population kind of representation. So I mean, it's like, you know, and maybe it's like reading into it too deeply, and there's a whole other conversation that we've had in the past about like, you know, how do we kind of even come together as Filipinos? And that as you guys were talking, I was thinking about kind of this other layer of it, and that, you know, depending on, you know, your kind of internal background from the Philippines, how you can kind of own all these different identities depending on like your phenotypical kind of like traits or whatever. And what does that have in terms of implications for Filipino Americanness as a pan-ethnic identity of itself? Like it's technically like, if there's like 7,000 islands and so many different ethno-linguistic cultures, is the identity of a Filipino its own kind of pan identity, right? So
yeah, totally. Yeah. And it's more prominent here, like in the diaspora as opposed to in the Philippines. Right? So like in the diaspora, you identify more as Filipino because you don't have those kind of issues that the Philippines is dealing with.
Yeah, like in the Philippines, they're like, well, I'm Bisayan. Like, I'm not going to deal with you, you Ilocano, or something like that.
Pampangans.
You know, like...
Because they're loud.
Because they're loud. Like,
that's like a recurring joke now.
sorry, Kapapangas are loud.
I think for me, I don't want to over police things either.
Yeah.
But I also find that more Asian American things that are more celebratory.
Asian American excellence.
Like some things that are more celebratory, they're gonna skew more East Asian. But I feel like the more progressive, more radical organizations or radical kind of projects are more inclusive, and I would kind of more gravitate towards that. And something like Asian American Excellence Awards, excellence in certain industries. It's like I know it's gonna be East Asian heavy, because it doesn't challenge anything, right?
Yeah,
it just challenges representation, which is like a mild way of changing things. But I just feel more progressive spaces will be more Southeast Asian, South Asian centric, because it's more because they're challenging kind of these American categories in itself. So I think for me, I'm just not like, I already know certain organizations are going to be more East Asian centric, but those are organizations where like I'm like, well, I don't really care about that shit anyway. So you know, I don't know.
I could think of a few where like I've gotten invitations to go to mixers and whatnot, and I'm like, I don't I don't care about this. I
Yeah.
don't want to go to this. Like, I know I
Yeah.
will be the only brown person there.
Yeah.
And then you see like the pictures that show up on Facebook for the event, and you're like, yep, I would have
Yeah.
been the only Filipino there if I
Yeah.
had gone.
And then I also think like we're also a little bit lucky in California where we can be more selective
Right.
and kind of the
True.
organizations, institutions to be that we
Yeah.
want to be a part of.
I think with identifiers, it always should evolve, right? I mean, I imagine there was a time where, you guys, I think Mike was talking about like the term of Asian American, where that kind of came from. I think it should always change.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is like, we needed to get some sort of identifier, whether it be through just making sure we got resources, representation, whatever it may be, to identify ourselves as Asian American. But you can't rest on that. After that, you do have to keep thinking about what's next and whether or not, Filipinos, we do deserve to have our own category, but that's not just for our sake, but for the sake of like actual representation or etc. So I think in general there is value to Asian American identifier. Then it's probably still valuable now in places that don't necessarily show the same diversity that we have in California. But for people to rest on that and just say, oh, that's enough and be lazy about it, I think we should challenge that part. So I kind of agree.
Here.
Yeah.
Here.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of the concluding question I had for this segment. Next, we're going to talk to Anthony Ocampo, who's going to be he's a professor at Cal Poly Pomona, and he's going to talk more about this subject later on. So after the break.
Ever wonder how someone can send you a cup of coffee through the air?
What?
I love coffee,
I love coffee
and
too.
I know Mike loves coffee.
A little bit.
Joe.
I don't drink coffee. I just like the taste.
Just the taste.
Well, if you've ever thought about sending This Filipino American Life a virtual cup of coffee, there's a website new to us called Ko-fi, ko-fi.com. Go to Ko-fi at / This Filipino American Life. Again, that's ko-fi.com/This Filipino American Life, and buy us a cup of coffee.
How much is a cup of coffee?
I don't know, like $3.
What?
Fancy pants.
I don't know. I heard some good cups of coffee cost like around $1 million.
This is true. If you ever want to virtually buy us $1 million cup of coffee, feel free. This is another way for you to contribute to This Filipino American Life. Buy us a virtual cup and keep listening to our podcast. Thanks.
And we're back.
Yay.
Welcome back to TFAL.
Nice little plug there for whatever we plugged.
We don't even know where you're plugging yet, dude.
No, that's why.
Rate us on
But I mean, I'm
iTunes.
sure it's nice, right? It was a
stars.
nice job, guys. Well done.
Good job on that coffee.
I don't know.
Buy some doctoral design.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should.
Not for me though, right?
Yeah, screw you, Ryan.
Anyway.
So yeah, we're back, and now we have our guest here. Hi.
Yay.
Hello. This is Anthony Ocampo, Dr. Anthony Ocampo.
What up, Doc?
He is
to see you.
assistant. Or
Associate.
Associate professor of sociology at Cal Poly Pomona, and a Ford Foundation fellow, or prior, right?
Yeah.
He's
It carries over.
It carries
It carries
yeah.
over.
It's like Mr. President.
He's just branded forever, and is the author of the Latinos of Asia: How Filipino Americans Break the Rules of Race.
Knox.
So welcome.
Thank you. I
Yay.
finally get to be on this show. So excited. I was like, me? Really?
Part of the circuit. We're part of the circuit.
Yeah, it just we have a long laundry list that we want to get through, and just we just don't get to
So
all of it.
Yeah.
This is very long.
Yeah.
Before we get to the meat of this, I'm very excited to have Anthony on here because Anthony and I actually went to high school.
We went to high school together, and I brought yearbooks. I wish you can't. Maybe you can post some of them pictures.
Oh, come on now. We don't need to do that. But there are yearbooks here.
Mike
I'm
got
like,
those pictures, right?
Oh, Jesus.
Oh, I took pictures of them.
Oh,
Yeah.
no. Oh, no. Maybe we should.
I got Ryan's senior quote.
Oh, no.
Oh, do you have it? What is? Dare we read it?
It has like no spaces on it. It has like 143 on it.
Life
God.
without
Oh, come
F
on.
is
A lie. It's supposed to be a lie. Because you
Thanks.
only had so many letters you could
Thanks
put.
to number
No,
2,
stop.
the following.
Stop it.
The following.
All right,
D.
all right. It's a shout out.
It's a shot.
Was it small letter, capital letter, small
Yes,
letter?
it was.
Some of them is, yeah.
It was?
Yeah.
Right.
Very
Come on.
embarrassing.
Hey, this was
is
10
the
years ago.
90s.
Number 4, making me life special, 143.
See, that's not even.
Wait, what was? Were you in Pinoy Pinay chat rooms on AOL as well?
Yes.
Asian Avenue.
Asian Avenue.
Maybe. Oh,
You
gosh.
were.
I think
We're
all of us
totally
did.
we're totally going off topic here.
Speaking of Asian Avenue, do Filipinos belong there?
Knox, good
Nah.
good segue.
Hey, okay.
So Anthony wrote Latinos of Asia, and it's a very popular book, and it's making a lot of rounds everywhere. You've been on NPR. You've been. Where else have you been? You've been.
I've been
on
Filipino stuff, Kabayan.
Yeah.
Kabayan today.
Oh, you did like several of those, didn't you? Like I feel.
Yeah, he did
There's a
history lessons.
couple.
Yeah, those were really cool.
Yeah.
And then some Philippine stuff. So ABS, some ABS, CBS.
Balitang America, were you there?
Yeah,
Okay.
that was fun.
Cool.
So that's all the stuff my parents really care about. When you being a Filipino child, that's your
Yeah.
metric of success.
So Latinos of Asia. What's the genesis of it?
Yeah. So what's funny is about you talk about these things like Asian Avenue or all these when social media emerged. There's this trend that I would notice growing up where it all started with MySpace, for example. In MySpace you build a profile. That's when everyone knew how to do HTML still. And there's that box where you could write like what ethnicity you are. And I noticed that a lot of the Filipinos that I would grow up with, smile for the picture. They would put other, or they would put like mixed or Pacific Islander. I'd be like, homie, you're not mixed. I know both of your parents, right? So, that's something I noticed on social. It's really easy to notice that on social media. But even growing up in Los Angeles, where there's all different kinds of Asian American groups, from Filipino, Chinese American, Vietnamese, Korean. Filipinos are just always used to just identifying as straight up Filipino. And so it wasn't until I got to college where, people were labeling me as Asian, and it started to make me think, when growing up, when you hear the word Asian, you're usually thinking about Chinese, Japanese, Korean, but you're not usually thinking about the brown kid with the last name Rodriguez or Torres that went to Catholic school, for example.
Right.
And so I thought, Filipinos, they're kind of a little bit different. So that's where that book kind of started. The ideas of the book started like many, many years ago before its publication.
Nice. So, what's your kind of central argument, you would say, in the book?
Yeah, well, I guess the main gist of it is that, when you think about racial categories like Asian, Latino, you always think about geography. So people will say things like, Philippines, it's in Asia, therefore
Yeah.
Filipinos are Asian. But the reality is people have all different sorts of rules in their head for how to categorize other people by race. So you'll look at things, not just what people look like or what country people are from, but you look at like last names, you'll look at religion, you'll look at what neighborhood people are from, and those become your cues to say, that person is Asian, or that person is Latino, that person's African American. And so the main gist of the book is that I was saying that there's a lot of, I guess, residue or legacies of colonialism from Spain and the United States that prompt people to see Filipinos a little bit different from other Asian groups. So your last name's Bernardo, your last name's Carpio, and oh my God, I don't know your last name. Sorry.
Oh, it's Delalas, so it's super
Delalas.
indigenous.
Super indigenous. I'm Ocampo, but there's like
Mike's
Rodriguez,
is
Torres.
Nailat, also indigenous.
That's super Filipino.
Yeah.
Yeah. But think about like if you were to upload your resume online and no one would see your face, they might assume based off your last name that this person's
Yeah.
Mexican American. And so I noticed in doing research and looking at everything from like survey data to interviewing people, there's a lot of Filipinos who had these kind of moments where people would assume that they were something other than Asian.
Right.
Most commonly Latino. So they'd be like in East LA or other parts of Los Angeles where 1 in every 2 people is of Latino descent, and then people would, speak to them in Spanish or assume that they were, someone of Latino descent.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember getting a bunch of like Hispanic scholarship stuff in high school. Like, I was like, what?
Yeah,
You know, a lot of
someone
that.
I know in high
Based on my
school
last name.
applied to it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I like got into an argument with him because I was like, "Yo, bro, we're Filipino. You're not Latino. Like, don't
Yeah.
apply to this. You're taking away
A chance, yeah.
chance for another kid, like one of our fellow Mexican or El Salvadorian like classmates."
Yeah.
And he was like, "Well, my middle name is Filipino because his last name was like Sugay," and I'm like, "That's Filipino, like full. No one's gonna think that you're Latino." But I think his middle name was like something else.
Way to out somebody.
I know. I mean, he probably doesn't listen, but I did get mad at him for doing that because I was
Yeah.
just like, "Yo, that's not you."
Yeah, and that, it makes a lot of sense because you think about like the educational pipeline and how there's a tremendous amount of underrepresentation of Latinos in say like higher ed, right? But the other thing is when you look at certain aspects of higher education, there's a lot of underrepresentation of Filipinos.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's like how many Filipino professors can you think of, or medical school students, law students? It's the for the amount of Filipinos that are in the state of California, the numbers at like graduate school level is pretty abysmal. And so in some ways, I can understand the sentiment of wanting to be part of a outreach program, but yeah, I agree with you that shouldn't be going for scholarships that are not intended for.
No, yeah, because I actually thought of doing that. Because when he did it, I was like, wait, can we really do that? And then I just felt guilty because, well, my last name doesn't sound Latino. But then if I used my middle name, it would, because Collyer is Spanish in origin.
Well, you don't want to be the like Rachel Dolezal of the Latino community or Filipino community.
Well, no, and also,
Alas.
man, don't do that. But like, yeah, you just don't want to take away resources. Like, we shouldn't be stealing other people's pie. We should be fighting for the fact that the pie is so small. Like,
Exactly.
we're supposed to be arguing like,
See, that's hella
make
structural.
the pie bigger for us.
So, you argue in your book that Filipinos lie within kind of these margins of these racial categories. Can you just kind of expand on your argument? I know you look at like neighborhoods, you look at education, you look at shared history of Filipinos, Latinos. Can you just kind of unpack some of the parts of your book?
Yeah, for sure. What a lot of people forget is that the term Asian American is a relatively recent origin. It's from the 1960s civil rights movement. So prior to that, people of color didn't really organize around racial identities. It was not until African Americans started doing this during the civil rights movement that other groups of color start to think, oh, race can become a basis of social movements, which is when Filipino Americans alongside with Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans got together under this coalition, this umbrella Asian American, right? But the reality is most people don't, since the 1960s, people tend to forget that the origins of Asian American identity are very political. And so the term Asian has evolved to be much more cultural in people's minds. So when people think about, ask people, what does it mean to be Asian? And they won't say the 60s, right? They won't say politics. They'll say things like, being Asian is, eating rice or taking your shoes off before you go in the house. They will say like sort of artificial things like that. And over the past half century, Asian American identity has come to be associated mostly with Chinese, Japanese, East Asian groups. And you see that, that's not just within Asian American organizations, Asian American studies departments. That's also like in like Hollywood, right?
Yeah.
When you think about a situation where the rare times that Hollywood will want to cast an Asian, if a Filipino actor were to walk in, they might be confused, going to be like, this is not what we're looking for. So it happens on all fronts that Filipinos don't fit into the Asian box. And I guess with respect to the other part about how do Filipinos fit alongside like in terms of their relationship with Latinos, Mexican Americans. Part of that was motivated by the fact that I grew up in Los Angeles. I'm from Eagle Rock, Northeast LA, and the Rock. And you're here from like Oxnard, the San Fernando Valley, Atwater. These are places where you just grow up seeing Filipinos alongside Mexican Americans, and you can't help but observe, wow, there's a lot of similarities in family dynamics, cultural traditions. And I thought, when I was in college taking these Asian American studies classes, I never saw that connection between Filipinos and Mexican Americans and other Latinos getting any airtime. And so I thought that's a story worth, especially being someone from California, that's a story that's worth telling. And so that's what motivated me to start this research project.
I used to tell like friends, like new Mexican friends or new Latino friends, well, specifically Mexican friends, I'm like, we have the same conquerors. Like we do the same, we have the same cultural traditions. Like the Spanish colonized both of our lands.
Yeah.
And then I always say like, but you got ballet folkloriclo and Lapu Lapu ate Magellan. So there's the difference.
Lapu Lapu ate Magellan.
Did he really eat
That's
him?
what I tell people. I have no idea if that's culturally accurate. I'm a historian.
It's the era of alternative facts and fake. It's all good.
You can say that.
Yeah.
Fake news, man.
Yeah.
Spanish tastes good.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we have afrittata.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about, since the book has been published, like I'm like, man, I think I needed to highlight more that colonialism, it's fucked up, right? Colonialism is a fucked up thing. There's hundreds of, like millions of people whose cultures and communities and families were destroyed. People were murdered, right? And so by no means do I want to like valorize, colonialism's like this, we have shared colonial culture. But you're right, is inevitably because of everything that happened with the Spanish colonial period, there's like 3.5 centuries, longer than the period Spain was in Mexico. There was all this cultural exchange.
Yeah.
Not even just with Spain and the Philippines, but actually Mexico specifically and the Philippines, which is something a lot of people don't know about. And so when you think about like 20th century occurrences, like I have a friend, Rudy Guevara, who
becoming Mexipino.
Yeah, he writes about historical Filipino-Mexican communities in San Diego, and when Filipinos started coming to the United States, they weren't allowed to intermarry with white women, and so in order to form families, they
so is there like a whole generation of Mexipinos in San Diego?
There are.
Oh yeah. A lot of them. Yeah.
We'd like to explore
A lot of
this
here,
one
all
day.
over California.
Yeah.
I have maybe this is for the group as well. Is there do you think there's still value to the category of Asian American, or do you think it's kind of like it might be deeper conversation?
That is like a really deep question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know it's not in our list, but I was just curious, just because of the way we talk about race. I'll go back to a quick story. I think I may have told you guys this before. My birth certificate, I don't know if you guys want to guess what my race is. You guys probably won't ever guess.
White.
Brown.
Brown.
They have
Yes.
a brown?
On my birth certificate.
That's what it says. Brown. You're of the brown
It says,
race.
The Philippines, they
it says
want you as
ethnicity
brown?
Filipino.
Uh-huh.
And then my brothers actually had ethnicity Filipino, race Filipino, which is, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then mine said race brown. I was like, I had to renew my passport. It got stolen. This was over 10 years ago. And I had to look for my birth certificate.
But your birth certificate was from the Philippines.
Yes.
So the
Oh,
Philippines, they
yes.
coded you
Yes.
as brown?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
It was a very interesting, and which leads us to the discussion of like kind of, these categories that sort of have evolved, and you're talking about like the 60s and the evolution of different categories, but
What other boxes were on the birth certificate?
I don't
other
know.
than brown.
I don't- but it was,
Red,
but it was also like
yellow,
it was typed in. But yeah,
purple.
So I actually
It was
looked
like
at
white.
kind of like Wikipedia it back
Yeah.
then, and there was definite categories of like areas of where yellow is and black is.
For
and brown
real?
is and white. Yeah,
They had black.
I
too.
think so. I think
Like if you
I
were
think
from
Africa was
Negros
black.
Occidental,
In the
they would
Philippines?
just mark
No,
you as black?
if you, it still probably exists, but categories of race for
Are you talking about like
statistics.
Mongoloid and Caucasoid and
Maybe.
Negroid?
I don't think it was.
Wow,
it was that.
all of those things are so problematic, but I know that they were
19th
on.
century anthropology.
Yeah.
but this was just color. This was just color. I don't know if it was color coded,
So
but
you came out and they're like, this kid's brown. And then if like a chinoid
Yeah, most
comes
babies
out,
are,
do
like,
they say
purple.
they're yellow?
no. But that's my point. Is it wasn't that. It was
Yeah.
there was probably a way to classify what your race is based on this color code.
Wow.
I don't even know the history of why
That's
yellow is a
fascinating.
thing for Asians, right? And then I looked at the kind of the history. There's probably some reference to it in the way we classified race.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, that being said, like that's changed, right?
Yeah.
No one ever calls you of the brown race anymore here. But in terms of like, the category of Asian American, I mean, we've been using it for such a long time, and I don't know if it still has kind of value.
Well, you say such a long time, but it really is like from the 60s.
no, I mean,
yeah.
I mean, like for us,
For us
like,
Yeah.
youngins, it is
Yeah.
a very long time. But that's a good question, and I think like earlier parts of my life, I used to have much more of a pessimistic view about what's the point of the term Asian. It's like not if anything, that's a term that when I walk into Asian spaces, I feel invisible or marginalized or not included. So in what use does this term have for me? None, but over time, you do a little bit of historical research and you start to appreciate a little bit about how, because of the lack of numbers, Filipino Americans, there are moments when Filipino Americans have benefited from Asian American spaces. I guess the first one I can think of is like Asian American studies, where if you're a Filipino kid in college and you want to do research on your community and your history, there's not going to be a lot of room to do it in your quote unquote regular history class. And an Asian American studies class, even if it's not taught by a Filipino, would be the first chance to really dive deep and see that your family's history has a lot of intellectual value. But then there's other arenas like politics where or Hollywood, or where Filipinos are regularly excluded from Asian American spaces and have become very angry about that. In fact, to the point where, like in California, I think Filipino local officials lobbied so that Filipinos would have their own box.
Yeah.
When you check, I mean, have you ever noticed that when you fill out a form, like back in the day when you're registering to vote, or you're filling out a form, it'd always be like white, Hispanic, Latino, African American, Native American, Asian, Filipino.
Right.
They always had their own box. That's because Filipinos in California lobbied to have that box because they felt they were being excluded from
Joe, you talked
Asian
about
American
that, right?
convos.
Yeah, that was in the late 70s. And Jerry Brown,
Tell us more.
Well, Jerry Brown, they called it Browns for Brown. And for real? That kind of group. Well,
Right
anyway,
there, we have a Brown with us today.
and in 1978, he basically signed into law that all California enumeration projects or anytime that California does any kind of demographic numbers have to include a Filipino separate box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of Filipinos who are just like over the Asian box. But then there's I have a lot of cousins that didn't grow up in places like California where there's like a ton of Filipinos. They grew up like in Jersey, where the term Asian has been really important for them. But I think for those of us that grew up in California, where we might take it for granted that there's just a ton of us,
right.
we don't got to do that.
Yeah.
It's of less use to us. So that's a big question.
I
though.
know. Sorry, I just came to me.
But I also think
Discussion.
like regionally, like Filipinos tend to identify differently depending on where they are, correct?
Yeah.
So I mean, you talked about your cousins who identify as Asian. When I was living in Seattle, a lot of kind of old activists very much claim Asian American. But then I think in University of Washington, a lot of Filipinos claim Pacific Islander.
Yeah.
So they're part of the
Yeah.
Pacific Islander
Oh, wow.
Alliance. Yeah.
That's
Really?
interesting.
Yeah, and then like
University of Washington?
something like in Irvine, right?
Yeah.
UCI, they kind of broke away from the Asian.
That happens a lot.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
was there.
we were there for that. So
I was there.
And then there's also different scholars who kind of also want to claim that, or not claim, but want to categorize Filipinos as more affiliated with like Pacific Islander,
Yeah.
or in area studies, for example, which is different from Asian American studies. Philippines, or the study of Philippines, gets kind of subsumed within Southeast Asian studies.
Yeah. Well,
And
it's
then-
interesting you bring up the Irvine and how Filipinos separated away.
Yeah.
And then you brought up how like the Browns for Brown, and it was like it was a resource accessibility for Filipinos in California, right? So that's why they were doing that. In Irvine at the time, the Filipino organizations pulled away. Again, it's a resource pull because at the time, if you're trying to get funding for your programs through like the Associated Student Government, they would allot the funds to the general umbrella for Asian Pacific American students. And Filipinos, I was a part of the organization, Kababayan. The complaint was we were one of the biggest organizations, and yet we have to ask the umbrella organization APSA for this part of the pie. Like, so it was like AS government was giving you $5,000. I'm making this up. And then but like 20 organizations would ask APSA for a piece of $5,000.
Yeah.
But us at Cabo was like, but we are such a big org. We put on this giant show. We need to get more.
Yeah, arguably Cabo was like bigger than all the other API orgs combined. By the way, I worked with APSA at the time.
Yeah, so Mike and I were like on different sides of that argument of coin. So like the reason why that exists, the Filipinos broke away and created their own umbrella was so that they can demand from the student government for our own $5,000 to distribute amongst other Filipino organizations.
And that is why I never joined Cabo.
Dun, dun, dun.
Like drama.
No, but it's often, I mean, pan-ethnicity, whether one belongs to a group or not, is all tied to resources.
Yeah.
It's not just like economic resources, but symbolic resources. Like who gets to be on the cover of a magazine, of an Asian American poster or Asian American publication, right? And there's this constant stories of Filipinos not fitting the mold of what people think Asian should be.
Yeah, like with this discussion, like there's a lot of hype right now with Crazy Rich Asians and how it's like coming out, and like everyone's like, we all have to support this movie because we're like Asian American, and like a part of me is like, but it's not my story. Like I don't give a shit about like crazy rich Asians. Like I don't identify with this life. Like have I met rich Asians like this? Only because I went to Irvine and I met these types of people is that when I experienced that. Otherwise, I don't identify with that at all.
And Filipinos are the underclass in Singapore.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
they wouldn't even look at me. Like, they would think I was someone's nanny or something.
And that's the thing too, is like this is what a lot of Filipinos spoke about when I interviewed them, is like, in my gut, do I feel like a lot of these things resonate with me? So for example, and for better or worse, like sometimes when East Asian groups get targeted for, the people say racist things about East Asian groups, Filipinos would be like, well, that doesn't for better or for worse, they'd say it doesn't affect me because I don't get rationalized in that particular way.
Or our parents racialized them as a...
Yeah.
Yeah.
right. They're totally anti-Chinese.
Oh my God, don't get me started on the things Filipino parents would say. But
what if you're Chinoy? That it's like you have to self-hate yourself?
I guess, yeah.
But you're right. But for example, like the Jeremy Lin thing, were Filipinos like doing backflips because Jeremy Lin was in the NBA? I don't think.
No.
It wasn't the case, right?
I kind of like well, that's it's all personal, right? Like I have a strong tie to like Asian American and that like label, but like I'm not gonna lie, there have been many moments, like I said, like I don't care about Crazy Rich Asians, even though like, I'll probably buy a ticket to support because I know that I know the cultural significance and importance of the box office dollar. But will I really want to watch the movie? I don't care. Like, no.
I like Nico Santos. He's hilarious.
So I've heard this. He's in that, him. Right?
Shameless plug for Filipino AF. We and Joe saw him at that improv show, and
UCB.
UCB. He was hilarious.
He's
I want
awesome.
him on the show.
He opened for Ali Wong.
He was
saw
your
him.
opener?
Yeah,
Nice.
like this was a couple of years ago. So yeah,
It's just, like we have this discussion all the time. Like when we were at the Identity LA show and at downtown LA, the lineup was like mostly East Asian, and but the best act on the lineup that we saw was Ruby Ibarra, who's Filipino American.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, what is it about? Like, I don't know. It's a very like touchy subject to me. Like,
it is. And as divided as you are, and you look at the numbers, like the straight up statistics about when Filipinos are given a form and it says, what is your racial identity? Like the truth of the matter is they did a survey in LA where they interviewed second gen Filipinos. So Filipinos whose parents are from the Philippines, but they were born here. And only like 45% of Filipinos picked Asian as their racial identity.
That's
45%.
interesting.
All the other Asian groups were like 95% plus. Filipinos were like 45%.
Well, going back to the kind of regional context, how
Yeah.
much is that is just an LA story?
I think that's the thing is like in LA where you have a lot of Latinos and Filipinos, I guess. I don't want to, how do I say this, but they have, and there's large numbers of Filipinos, and then Filipinos can also say, hey, like we're, in terms of like panethnic identity culture, we kind of have a lot of cultural similarities with that other group, and they get to notice it on the regular, they just like walking the streets. So I think there's definitely, it's a very California, LA phenomenon. So like when I like the statistics I'm talking about where Filipinos don't pick Asian, that happens in places like Los Angeles, San Diego. Anecdotally, you know, when you think about the San Francisco Bay Area, it was really interesting to see whenever I do like talks on my book, I get very different reactions from Filipinos from San Francisco and Daly City, where they grew up alongside Chinese Americans, versus the ones from like San Jose and Union City, where they grew up
interesting.
alongside
Latinos.
Yeah. It's so different, the reactions.
So
that-
what
What
is
are the
the
reactions?
difference? Yeah.
What's the difference?
the Union City, San Jose Filipinos are like, oh man, I totally get it. I grew up, my neighbors are Mexican. When I was in school, people sometimes thought I was Mexican. And
Yeah.
so it resonates with them. Whereas the ones that are from
Daly City.
Daly City, San Francisco are like, oh, you know, that wasn't really ever my experience to see myself aligned with Latinos. So I think it's not just like state regionally based. It could even be as local as like neighborhood.
Yeah.
That makes
Based.
sense. Well, also, if that was a survey done in LA and since or in California in general, like we grow up with the boxes to check. We have the option to check Filipino. But what if you grew up in an area where you don't? Like, will you lean towards the Asian one then?
I think most people would lean toward the Asian box, you know. But then what's always funny is then I have, so even if people check the Asian box, it's funny how they might check that box, but everything about their life experience will be very different than what that box would suggest.
Yeah.
So what's funny to me is when I meet Filipinos from like Arkansas.
Yeah.
Or like Arkansas, I'm thinking of a very specific one. If he listens to this, he'll know what I'm talking about. Arkansas, Texas, where there's only black, Latino, white, and maybe like the Chinese like family that owns the local Chinese restaurant or something. But that's it.
Yeah.
And so in those spaces, a lot of Filipinos will say, oh, in that context where the only three options are white, Mexican, and black, they'll throw me a lot. They'll see me more as like one of the Mexicans,
Interesting.
even though they know that
Right.
like to check the Asian box, you know, they'll see like, oh, my last name's Guevara or something like that.
Wait, is that what somebody else categorizes, or do they themselves choose the Mexican?
They'll
box?
pick the Asian box like when they're filling out a form,
okay.
but then when they're at school. The teachers, the counselors,
We'll
the
see
classmates
them
will see them
as-
as just another Mexican.
So this
kid.
is very helpful because I have a niece and nephew who are growing up in Arkansas.
Oh, for real?
So I'm gonna be like, hey, I'm gonna teach them and say, you're Filipino, bro.
Yeah.
Stay.
And at the end of the day, I think that's what came across is even though there's a lot of like this, like, oh, we don't fit in any of these larger umbrella boxes. Filipinos are very, very clear that like we're Filipino. In fact, like that's like what's interesting is the stories of people would say like, oh, I just cross off the options and I'll write in Filipino. There were so many people that said they would do stuff like that because they were just so fervently Filipino.
Right.
That's interesting.
And I mean, why not? Like we're dope
I know
people.
somebody who
Yeah.
does that because she's mixed race.
Really?
Yeah, like if there's not a mixed race or biracial box, she will just she will click or cross Asian if I have to pick one.
Yeah.
And then we'll mark other boxes or like create other like because you can't, if you're mixed race, you can't pick just
Yeah.
one. That's not fair, right?
Yeah.
So like,
I don't know if this is off topic, but how does this fit into the data disaggregation conversations that are happening?
of course you ask as a data person.
Yeah.
I think it does. You know, I think when you think about what has been happening to the Asian American community at large, the fact of the matter is it's subsumed under this larger framework of like whiteness and white supremacy, right? Which doesn't allow much room for nuance, complexity, diversity, particularly economic diversity. And so it's like this fucked up story of like Asians are the model minority, which I wish you could zap people every time someone says that or electrocute them because it's just because I mean, how can you call this group that includes Hmong Americans, like refugee groups, like people from war-torn countries, model minority by any means, so with the data disaggregation, as a data, like I deal with quantitative data, I don't understand the argument against data disaggregation, because as a statistician, you can easily just like type one line of code and then collapse everyone. So it's so stupid that like people think you shouldn't disaggregate data because you can always collapse categories later.
Yeah, it feels like a conversation that's largely centered in like what the Northeast, and it's like amongst East Asians who are fighting against it, and I don't understand the
Chinese immigrants.
Yeah, I guess I don't understand the arguments either, but
What
yeah.
are new Chinese?
Well, Chinese immigrants who just came here.
Oh, okay.
No,
Oh,
old
sorry.
Chinese immigrants.
I didn't know if they are they.
Fine, recently immigrated Chinese. Sorry.
No, but is it because like they would choose like Taiwan or something, or Hong Kong, or
No, because I guess because they're coming in, buying into kind of the idea of the model minority as a good thing. And so the idea that you would, this is how I understand it, the idea that you would start to kind of break that apart and kind of show that it isn't quite the model minority that it's made out to be because of these other groups that are have different experiences or whatever.
it's like saving face, but then like because Filipinos and Vietnamese and Hmongs and Cambodian Americans have such like a basically all the Southeast Asian experience.
They don't want the brown Asians to solely the name
like
Asian.
stop fucking up our story.
Yeah, like we're not all making it.
I mean, that's how I understand. I don't really understand it, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
So, kind of going back to the kind of the validity of Asian American as a category. Do you believe that Filipinos should continue to contest Asian American as a category, or like expanded definitions of Asian American, or should we be separate?
See,
Separate but equal?
Or it just depends on the context, right?
Here's the thing. If you go into another let's say like by some random move, like some people lobby and say, oh, let's go join like the Latino box. I don't think that would lead to the same problems, if not worse, because Filipino percentages would be tiny. Filipinos don't generally speak Spanish, and so it would just be marginalized in the same way. I like this idea of expanding, right? And I think that it doesn't just apply to Asian Americans, but all groups. Oftentimes with the emergence of racial categories, there's always this need to like categorize like the good blank versus the bad blank. So you can think about African Americans, you can think about gay people, you can think about Mexican Americans. There's this impulse to always say like, oh, we know there's these negative stereotypes about African Americans, gay people, Mexican Americans, so let's like shine a light on the different, like the ones that are thriving, right? And I don't think that dichotomy is very useful. What I really like is what's going on. You see this a lot with like Black cultural production, with things like Insecure, with Issa Rae. Issa Rae. I'm sure this comes up in conversation. I read the whole book, by the way, but where they're trying to expand notions of what it means to be a Black woman that's not just so restricted to these narrow types. And I think that the reality is, if there's that, I love, for example, what's that show, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend?
Yeah.
That's a show about Asian Americans that's expanding people's notions about what it means to be Asian American, because I mean, dinuguan, right? Like,
I mean, that show like highlighted Filipinos.
Yeah. And I think that's the deal, is like, if there's any way to expand the meaning, like that's the solution, I think, is like, let's expand our notions for what it means to be Asian American. And I think that what's nice about social media today is you have things like YouTube, where there's a ton of Asian Americans that are putting out images of what it means to be Asian American, but on their terms, that's not so dictated by like, oh, white people treat us like this, therefore we have to like respond accordingly. They're just themselves. Like, they're musicians, they're satirists, they're comedians. I absolutely love Ali Wong, because I think she's someone that's just like, fuck it, I'm gonna be me. Or Randall Park, or these people that are, yes, they're aware of the stereotypes that exist, and so they strategically use them and then use it to like mindfuck people and say, hey, we're actually much more.
Yeah.
We're much more than this lame stereotype of what you think.
Because a lot of the reaction is the reaction to how Asian Americans are racialized in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't think people should base how they construct their identity based off the way they're like only based on how people stereotype them.
Yeah.
You know? That's the thing. That's the great thing about when you have Filipino orgs like at a UC Irvine or Berkeley is that there's a critical mass of Filipinos. So, you know, if you want to be the skater, you can be the skater. If you want to be the tap dancer, you can be the tap dancer. There's no need to, you don't have to be like
The Filipino.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
Yeah.
Driving a Civic around.
A Rice Rocket Integra.
Wow, Joe, you're just talking about yourself.
Do you have a Civic or an Integra?
How many, Joe?
A 95 Civic. Yeah. Yeah.
How many, Joe?
Oh, no. It's at my dad's house. So I actually wanted to ask you, I know in your book, you interviewed a lot of second generation Filipino Americans.
Yeah.
How much of your argument is specifically just for second generation? How do, for example, immigrant Filipino Americans react to your claims, or people in the Philippines? If you got any of that kind of reaction?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I think that being an immigrant to this country is a very different experience than being born in the United States, right? You come from a society, as Ryan was implying, like there's the set of rules that exist for identity. They're not based off like if you're black, white, Latino, Asian. They're based off if you're like Ilocano, Visayan. Like it's maybe that's the categorization. And so if that's what you grew up with, coming to the United States and having these other types of categories thrusted on you, you're not going to grapple with it in the same way. And in a similar way, like I think with say like third generation, the ones who's I don't know, like their parents were born in the U.S., or their parents were born in the U.S. They have less exposure to Filipino language and culture. They're gonna have a very different experience too. So yeah, I think in a lot of ways, this book, and this is very specific because in the field of sociology, studying the second generation children of immigrants is like a big thing. But in some ways it is like the argument of the books they're very much specific to that segment of the population. And I think that's okay, because I think going into writing the book, I never wanted to be someone that wrote like the book on Filipinos. In fact, I wanted to write a book that would get people to think, oh, that's not really my experience, so it's kind of compelling me to be
to challenge.
I like when people challenge it, because it shows that they're invested in the question of identity. So I wrote the book in a way where it would resonate with like a second gen population, but also in the hopes that someone out there would be like,
this is not my experience.
Tiffed enough to be like, I want to write. Yeah. I want to write about what it means to be a Filipino from Virginia, or a Filipino who grew up in Italy, because there's some of this that I can vibe with, but it's not complete. And so let me try to add to it.
Kind of like this show.
Yeah.
I guess so.
So I had this law professor who he was on my dissertation committee, and he said, he was making a criticism of academics, and he's like, man, academics, the way they write is just like, they like make an argument and then they put all the limitations for why their argument sucks somewhere there. And it's like, why would you, in law, you don't do that. You muscle your argument, and you fight for whatever you're arguing, right? You don't say, here are all the holes, and like use them to fuck me up, right? You like, so he had this phrase that I'll never forget. He said, sometimes you got to be a little problematic to be provocative. And I think in some ways, it's not like I was deliberately trying to like provoke people, but I wanted people like kind of like art, art that gets you talking is good. So but I've gotten a fair amount of, some people like hate the title, for example.
Oh, so why the title? That was actually one of my questions.
Do some people hate the title because they are racist towards Latinos?
Oh my God. Yeah. I'm like, and in some ways I like that the title does that. It allows for people to get checked on whether they have these latent like anti-Latino views, right?
I mean, because that is an experience that I have experienced a lot.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. A lot of people are like, we're not Latino.
Yeah, totally.
Not the Spanish.
Yeah,
I'm not
like,
Mexican.
So, yeah, why-
like I've heard that several
Yeah.
times.
Why Latinos of Asia?
yeah. So
And not like blacks of Asia,
yeah, because that
brown Americans.
you've heard like people have heard that
Yeah.
through casual conversation
Yeah.
as well.
Pacific Islanders of Europe.
You know, like I had an original.
Is that a real thing? No. Oh my god,
Vicky,
that
you
would
know.
make me so livid. But
I had in undergrad. I had a professor who was half Chicano, half Filipino. His name's Rudy Busto at UC Santa Barbara, actually, and he said, "I think Filipinos are Pacific Latinos." I thought that was like, oh, that's an interesting use of like a racial catchphrase that you can't help but pay attention to it, and
Yeah.
it makes you want to talk and ask more. Right? Originally, my the title of the book was different. Like I wanted to title the book "Racial Chameleons." Because I was like, what color you are depends on the background that's surrounding you. And I thought that for a lot of Filipinos, that encapsulated their experience of like, oh, if a Filipino is kicking it in East LA, people might perceive them to be Latino. But if they're in, an Asian American space, maybe they'll perceive them to be Asian. Like they can switch colors just like chameleons. Well, you don't have a lot of control over your title. Publishers actually determine
know that.
yeah they determine a lot of things about your book, even though you wrote everything in the middle. The title is the publisher has the final word.
so the publisher thought that this was the sexier title.
Yeah, so the publisher is concerned about selling books, of course.
Yeah.
And originally, because in the interviews, a lot of people would say, some people said Latinos of Asia, some people said like Latin Asians, Hispanic Asians. But a lot of people said, oh, Filipinos are the Mexicans of Asia.
I've
And
heard
so-
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in LA, we've heard that a lot.
Yeah.
So the publisher of the book was like, that's a great title for the book. Can we call it The Mexicans of Asia? And I was
Oh, that
like,
would make so many people mad.
I was like, oh my God, I can't imagine all the machistas and all the like Chicano nationalists would be like, and I thought that was a little bit like, that's like, yeah, a white person would be like, oh, that's such a great title. Go
Yeah.
for it. Right. But like, as someone that has to actually live and deal with the consequences, I was like, that's just not, I don't think that's,
Yeah.
I don't think it's appropriate because Mexico has a long, yes, people said that, but Mexico has a very long history that's distinct on its own, and that's just not cool.
Yeah.
And so I thought, Latino is a very U.S. It's a racial identity that was constructed in the U.S. And I was like, okay, maybe that could kind of fly. And it was a little bit of a middle ground between me and the publisher. And to be honest, at the end of the day, I'm in academia, and the reality, I have no problem saying this. Academia doesn't give a fuck about Filipinos, right?
Yeah.
And so in my head, I was like, anything that gets people to read about our community by any means necessary,
Yeah.
You're here.
I'm down, even if I take a couple hits. And I think that the reality is that that title has gotten the book a lot of traction in ways that have allowed me opportunities to talk about Filipinos.
You became provocative. It was like like you say, problematic leads to being provocative, right?
Yeah. So, and I think there's a lot of examples that happen with like movies or where the title is what gets people in. And then now that I got your attention, let's have like a more nuanced conversation.
So clickbait. I'm just kidding.
Clickbait. Totally. Yeah. I don't know. Let's say I had to write this book at a different time, like 10 years from now, who knows if the title will
It
stay
would
the
be
same.
like Latino X.
Latinx. Oh my gosh. What did you think of the whole Filipinx? Have you had that
We had that
convo?
had a
discussion, and we basically said we're old.
We're old. Because we did the @ sign. That
I
was
do remember
we
that.
did
Yeah.
We talked about that too.
We're talking about how it's binary.
Uh-huh.
And, I don't know.
It challenges me.
It challenges us to be more inclusive and to kind of understand. But I don't know. Elaine said she didn't like the X part because it was just kind of X has a certain
it has like a certain tone. It's like
certain
a
context.
context with like Malcolm X, and it's like a
you
black
thought it's
experience,
appropriation?
and I
It's
think-
appropriating?
Yeah.
I felt like it's taking away from like that history and a tie to it.
Yeah.
And then I know like Latinx is people are all about that, and that's the trend. And then Filipinos are doing it now, like Filipinx, and it just feels like the train is going. And it's like, do I get on the train and just ride on it, or do I just be that old person that's going to hang out on the bus?
See, are we those old people that are unwilling to embrace new identities?
We're there now.
Oh my god! I know someone called us elders.
I'm 36.
Oh,
be
us
37.
too.
28.
I'm forever 23. So
Did you ever go to Rewind in Arena on Thursday nights? Yeah, that's like our era.
Totally.
I'm really embarrassed to say yes.
Anyway, off topic. Totally off topic.
I'm
but-
like, I thought you were gonna say circus, and then I was just
no,
no.
circus.
So
yeah,
I guess we concluded that it's okay that for people to use it.
Yeah.
But just don't impose it on anyone.
yeah.
I think at the end of the day, people should determine their own identities.
Yeah, I said to Joe, you know what? I don't necessarily agree with it, but most likely I will probably use it.
Yeah.
Like moving forward in the future, just to be like, this is what it is.
I can't get around the whole like woke Olympics where people are like,
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
you need to do. I'm like, yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone's always trying to.
I mean, it takes
power
you just
somehow.
need to like wrap your head around it and move forward. Like language always moves forward. Like I don't use the word retarded because like that is offensive. So I'm not going to use it as a descriptor.
Yeah.
I don't say that's so gay because I'm not in high school anymore. And it's also not a good descriptor. So you just learn to say like, why do you think that is what that is? And you're like, at the end of the day, it's like, because something was stupid. So you say, well, then you just say that's stupid or that's dumb. Don't use retarded or don't use gay because that is offensive until you move on.
So I remember a couple years ago, you wrote an open letter to your Filipino American students.
Oh yeah.
Can you talk about that letter a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah, so it was
Sorry, that wasn't part of the list of questions.
not at all. No,
I'm like
don't
fascinated
worry.
by the story already.
No. Part of the in writing the book, I've always felt like and all of us in this room that are really invested in learning about Filipino American community issues and history, like that, our community has such a rich, like so many rich cultures within it. It's so diverse. It's so amazing. And I'm just like, man, I would love for Filipino, maybe I'm being judgy old person, right? And I just wish like I understand the function of Filipino American orgs is to like get people to socialize together, but in my head to dance, right? But it can't be all social, right? There has to be some accountability for like the trailblazers that have allowed you to be as free as you are, right? And that I think means reading history, reading literature, reading politics. And when you're well read on history, politics, and literature, I think that will make you care about other important issues like the 2016 election or Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement or, what's going on with the larger LGBTQ movement. And so I think I wrote a letter maybe a day or two after the Trump election. Ugh, I puked in my mouth. So like, oh my God, don't get me started on Filipinos that voted for Trump. But
It's okay. We've already.
My parents.
so Trump got elected. I was teaching sociology of gender on a Tuesday night. So I hosted a viewing party for my students.
Oh my God, that's traumatizing.
I was like, I wish I could remember I wish I was at a party in 2008 when Obama got elected. And I was like, I'm going to create this moment for my sociology of gender students to witness the first female president getting elected.
Oh no.
And as you know, it didn't really play out that way.
Yeah.
Right? And so I have a lot of students who are DACA undocumented, who don't have DACA status, who are maybe their parents are undocumented, maybe students who are Muslim, basically the students who are women, basically any.
So you hosted a viewing event and watched everyone cry?
It wasn't crying so much as just shock and silent, like shell shock
And panic?
Maybe panic. Yeah.
panic.
I had panic.
I was like, it was like the first week after the election. I I thought it was like, you know, when someone passes away in your family and you just can't imagine that this is real. Like the day of the election, Joe, who's my partner, who's sitting on the couch right behind us, he talked to me about a contingency plan for if we get murdered because we're a gay couple living in the time of like,
Oh my
like
god.
that is a conversation
That's a reality
That you never
we
thought
had
about.
to have.
that we had because
Yeah.
it was also the same year as the Pulse shooting.
Yes,
right?
yes,
So,
yes.
you know, Pulse shooting, Trump election, I was like, holy shit, what's happening, right?
Yeah.
And so imagine like, so the Pulse shooting in Orlando happened, the Trump election happened, and the pipeline stuff was going on.
Yeah.
And so I remember this moment where the day after election, I would walk into this campus's API center, and I just see, like, at Cal Poly, it's mostly the Barcata, the Filipino American org. Everything was just hunky dory, and I was like, how can everyone was just chilling as
They
if
didn't have a reaction.
there was
to
as
it?
if nothing happened on November 8th,
or whatever,
2016. It was as if, I mean, I don't know if they were grieving and they just happened to look jovial, but one of the students who is an ethnic studies major that was part of Barcata was like, nobody fucking cares that Trump was elected. Like, nobody cares. And so
Did that student say that to you, or was that like
they
the
emailed me. They were. I think they were in my class, or they emailed me, and they're like, "It's as if it didn't. Like, you know, it's as if nothing happened." And I
my
just
God.
everything about growing up Filipino and denying, like all the like experiences of Filipinos denying reality started to like. I started to get
came
shook.
to a head?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, as the Pulse shooting happened at a queer Latino club, so that
Yeah.
hit me really hard.
Yeah.
because I came of age in these type of settings, so
Yeah.
I was very like no fucks given at this point, and so I was like, let me go on Medium and just like crank
Write
this letter
that.
out and just fucking. I don't even remember what it said, but I was like, Filipinos, like wake the fuck up, you know?
Yeah.
And I hate being like I said, I don't like the woke police or like but I was like, how can you not react to what is going on as
How can your
someone
reaction be ambivalent?
how can you have ambivalence about someone that has been openly bragging about sexual assault, openly anti-immigrant, openly anti-Muslim, like all the, you know, when you look at everything that he was saying and you're aware of what was happening to Filipinos throughout their history in the United States from the 1898 Spanish American War to like if you fucking knew any of this stuff that happened in with the Filipino American War or the Filipino farm workers, the labor movement to the 1950s and 60s, like you should give a fuck that this monster got elected.
Yeah.
So the idea that they looked
like nothing was
happened,
nonchalant.
I just needed to like
You had
say
to
something.
exercise that. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your reaction? What was the reaction to the letter?
You know,
Any students kind of challenge you or anything like that, or
no, I had mostly students that were like, "Thank you for writing that letter," because I didn't have the capacity. It means something coming from an authority figure versus like
A
your,
fellow
your
student.
peer.
So was it one of these situations where like those students who were nonchalant, they weren't politically active, or like they didn't have any type of agency or investment into like political structure?
Yeah, and, you know, as I thought about it a little bit more, like I have to burp. I'm sorry.
We're all human. We all burp.
Yeah. As I thought about it more, like my more sympathetic read of it is that, you know what? National politics, local politics, since when have they ever centered Filipino experiences or Filipino American communities? How can you, like, it's never been the case.
Yeah.
When you think about the educational system, I think is a big, like, that's a big thing that I've come to blame more so than Filipino college students, because I'm like, if you grow up in a school context where from kindergarten through 12th grade, maybe you read 3 lines about your people, of course you're not going to think
that it
matters.
that it matters, right? And even in the college context, how many times maybe you'll have one Filipino American studies class, but then you'll kind of see it as like, oh, that's just that class we took for fun, not something that's like a serious, rigorous topic, you know? Yeah, and I think it's
or the public discourse is anti-Latino.
Yeah.
And then Filipinos are like, oh, those are just Mexicans. And
Yeah.
Right.
We're
It's not
fine.
about
There's like
Yeah.
a dissonance that they could like for somehow like have in relation to it.
Yeah.
That was my frustration with the whole thing because like certain Filipinos were like, oh, well, we're going to vote for Trump anyway. And
Yeah.
I wanted to be like, yeah, how can you say that when you have a relative who is also TNT?
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
not care about your own family?
Yeah.
Or like with the Pulse shooting, they would be like, well, we don't care because blah, blah, blah. And I'm like,
Yeah.
how can you say that when you have an uncle or a tita or a cousin who identifies? Like, how do you compartmentalize your, for the most part, it always felt like religious Catholic upbringing influence where they were like, no, you can't do these things.
Part of it, yeah.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
a lot of people like older Filipinos were like, well, we're voting for Trump because he's anti-abortion,
Oh my
allegedly.
God.
And I'm like, why is that always going to be the one thing?
So fucking stupid.
It's like all you care about is these babies being born, but you're not caring about people who actually exist,
are alive.
who
They're
are
getting
alive.
like raped or killed.
Yeah,
Because
like what
of
is
patriarchy or
Catholicism
racism.
is terrible sometimes. That's what I'm saying.
So we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
But your first book was talking
Yeah.
about Filipino Americans' marginal existence within
Yeah.
Asian America.
Oh, can I do a quick plug real quick?
Oh no!
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about your second your
Yeah.
current book.
Yeah. So, quick plug
Okay.
before that
Yeah,
is
yeah.
so with the book, what I didn't realize is I started a Facebook page for it. And so, yes, I used the Facebook page to talk about the book and the book's issues related to immigration, but when I feel like there's an important need to take a stand against Trump or take a stand against, sexual harassment, or I use, because I've gathered a couple thousand Filipinos,
Use that forum as a
use
way.
that to,
Yeah.
to help shape conversation so that Filipinos can't be so oblivious. I mean, who knows if they go on the page, but at least they'll have some resource
Yeah.
where they can know what side to be on instead of being ambivalent. But about your other question about
So you're talking about like POCs, immigrants, marginal position within the queer community.
Yeah. So, I was at UCLA for grad school, and I was studying immigration. And what was interesting to me is that, as anyone that's gone to grad school know, grad school is all about learning more and more about less and less. And so my focus was on immigration. I focused on like immigrant experiences. And what's funny is that when you're reading this research, these books and these articles about immigration experiences, and even when you turn on stuff about immigration on the news, you never hear about the experiences of immigrants or children of immigrants who happen to be LGBTQ, right? And so what was happening is that, in fact, anytime you heard anything about LGBTQ people, it's mostly about white gay people. So you think about like Will and Grace, blah, 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 like Neil Patrick Harris, Ellen, all great people, but like it's mostly white
Yeah.
representation. And so during my UCLA years, I was also, exploring other aspects of my identity. But I happened upon a social network of queer communities of color that were thriving. A lot of people that were second generation, Latino, Asian American, Filipino. And I just thought, wow, there's this community that exists that I am now a part of, whose stories are not getting any airtime when people talk about immigration, when people talk about race, when people talk about LGBTQ issues. They're just kind of on the margins of all three. And so I started a research project in grad school where, because in grad school we have like methods classes, so I had to do like actual research. And I'm like, I'm already spending so much time in these queer community of color spaces that I just started to kind of like interview people. Or if I had like an ethnography assignment, I would like do it
So
on
it's like
those-
qualitative?
yeah. So yeah, since maybe about 2007,
wow.
I've done a lot of qualitative interviews of second generation queer people, mostly men of color, because that's the community I have access to. And so it's funny because people are like, oh, you're working on a book, and then I forget that the first book took forever to write, and I'm like, this is taking forever too. But yeah,
Well, that's like over 10 years worth of data to go through.
I know, it's a lot. And so I'm working on a book right now on queer boys of color that grew up in immigrant families, because I was thinking about how society's attitudes toward gay people has shifted so dramatically. and people are so accepting now. But the reality is there's so many painful experiences that I associate with being gay that even if society accepts it, you don't forget all the fucked up things that happened when you were younger. Those things stick with you. They affect you. They shape your relationships. They shape your dynamics with your families. And so, in this book, I imagine that every chapter is kind of dedicated to one aspect of people's lives. So, like, what it's like to be queer and brown in immigrant family. What's it like to be queer and brown in high school, college? The gay scene where it's still predominantly white, right? So yeah, that's what's happening. Because I think like I want to document that stuff. What's funny, I brought these Loyola High School yearbooks, and I still remember. I was in downtown LA. Me and Joe were going to the Red Line, which is like a gay club, caters to a lot of men of color, and I ran into this dude that was like a huge bully of mine in
high school.
In high school, and he was like, "What's up, man? How you been? It's so nice to see you." And I'm like, "What the fuck?" Like,
Oh my god!
like you can't just because of like marriage equality, you can't just be all like I remember all that shit.
Well, he was going to the club.
He was all because gay people are cool now, so it was like okay.
Oh god.
Oh, so then you
He wasn't he wasn't gay. He wasn't going to the club.
Oh,
I just happened to run into him in downtown.
I thought he was just closeted. That's why.
I thought the narrative was going too.
No. But he was like, he was hanging out across the street, and
I see.
He's like, "Oh, me and my girlfriend have gone there," and he was just so casual about it. And I thought, man,
But all you were thinking was like, you
Remember
were the
back then,
asshole.
motherfucker?
yeah, in my mind, I was
Sure.
I was gracious.
Sure.
And then petty on the side, but like, petty is powerful. Everyone, Filipino has a Filipino side of me. Be petty, but I'm like, I don't want people to forget that like the amount of choreography that young queer people of color go through to navigate their identities is tremendous. The ways in which a lot of the young men I interviewed talk about everything I did in my house, which is supposed to be the place you're supposed to feel most safe. Like I had to change what I wear. I had to change my voice inflections. I had to be strategic about which friends I talked to on the phone and who I brought home. I had to be like, I had to make sure that I had enough of a ratio of hanging out with girls and boys so that my parents wouldn't get suspicious about me being gay. And then when they got to high school, it was like I had to make stories of like, I had to make sure I get in the AP and honors classes because if I'm in the regular classes, I'm going to get beat up because, boys are more like they test your masculinity more. Or I need to work my ass off so I can get to college so I can go far away because like all this.
So you can create a new life and a new story.
Yeah. There's so much fucking labor that goes into a person being a well-adjusted, openly gay person, adult.
Yeah.
That I think with everything that's happening with marriage equality just gets forgotten.
Yeah.
It just gets forgotten. And the thing I hate most is when people say things like, "Oh, I already knew you were gay." I'm like, bitch, like if someone comes out to you, that took a lot of work to get to that moment. So don't diminish the
That happened to me.
Oh, really?
Well, I was in college, so I'm gonna forgive like 22-year-old.
Oh, yeah.
Because I didn't know any better, but I had a friend actually come out to me.
Oh.
And then I was like, I thought everyone knew. Like my actual response was, "Weren't you already out?"
And that's the intention. I think was good.
Yeah. But and then I reflect on it now, like how horrible was I? But I was like, again, I was 22 years old. I had no emotional or like mental capacity to be an empathetic human being, apparently. But I also just didn't know, like, it was like life experience. And then now I'm like, oh, okay.
And I think, maybe there was a book out there you read in class that it would have helped. And I think in the same way that the Filipino book, like I love when people tell me like, "Oh, I never thought about Filipinos, but after meeting you now I do." Like in the same way, like that's what I hope is that, people don't always think about queer members that are
No, totally.
the experiences of what it means to be queer at like a Filipino family party,
Totally.
or like at the church, or like what does it mean when like you go to mass, and this happened to me where
Church.
the priest is saying you should vote yes on 8 because we have to protect marriage.
I stopped going to church, so I didn't have to experience
We walked out.
I walked out of a mass. I think I mentioned this during the Catholic priest episode we had. I walked out of a sermon, and wrote one of my priests a letter.
Strongly worded email.
Letter.
I think a strongly worded letter.
Letter. Like,
Yeah.
I'm like, you need to talk about them priests that are touching people
Yeah.
more,
Yeah.
the gay people in your church community. But like, it was that that side by side of like, oh, you're silent on this issue, but then you're very vocal
on
about
that,
that. I couldn't get around it.
That's just an interesting topic that you're researching and doing, like writing about, because I actually mentioned this to Mike yesterday when we were driving. So Karen Thompson, former guest of the show, she's a fellow academic with you guys, and she's
me, not me.
okay, but she, you guys all have PhDs, so I think you're all like brainiacs together. But she talked about her travels in Asia. She's a queer woman. She's married, right? And how she's not trans. She doesn't identify as trans, but she presents like most people will interpret her as a man. And she talked about how when she was traveling in Asia, she just went into the men's room because she didn't want to deal with people in the women's bathroom looking at her and questioning her.
Yeah.
And then this is all in the episode of Pop Rocket I listened to this past week, and how like she went to a Korean spa, and a Korean spa you're like fully naked in the spa. So when she went to the check-in, she had to talk about how like she wore her most femme outfit, and then like people were still like questioning her, and she was like, I was in a boat neck shirt and capris, and in my head I'm like, that doesn't sound right for her. Like, I'm knowing her now, I'm like, that's not a right outfit for you. But that was what she needed to do,
the labor, right?
to do that. And that was like, it's totally what you're saying about like what you have to do as a queer person of color, just to like travel. And I was telling Mike, like, wow, that's like such a different layer, because like we don't think that way because we are straight couple, but we also have the layer of like, well, when we travel, we have to think, well, we're a straight brown couple,
of course.
So where are we gonna go in this country? So like there are certain like cities or states where I'm not going to go to,
and as
comfortable.
As a queer male, I don't think about like it's. I have my moments too, where, for example, I teach a night class, and with my mostly women in my class, and they're like, I saw them waiting. They weren't leaving to go to their cars yet, and I was like, oh, class is over. Why are you still here? And they're like, oh, we have to walk in groups because as a woman walking at night. And I was like, oh, I'm fucked up. Male privilege never has thought about what it means to be a woman walking at night.
No, and I've actually had this conversation with Mike numerous times. Like when we go to certain areas, like Mike likes to walk in alleys. Because he thinks that alleys are more interesting to walk in. I don't understand.
Better pictures.
Do it for the gram.
But for me, like walking in an alley is traumatizing, because I have trained as a woman to fear being in an alley.
Of course.
Like, I hate it when it gets dark, when when it changes to standard time.
Yeah.
Because leaving campus, like the walk from my office to a parking structure is really like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But 5 minutes in the dark on an empty campus is frightening. And I totally do the like keys in my fist, like
Wolverine hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ryan, if you want to give me a blade, I guess I could carry around knives. But
that's real.
But that's a real thing, And so like, just to put it back to like queer people of color, like there are just always going to be so many layers to what your safety is, right?
Yeah.
Like
there's a lot of layers, and that's why the Pulse shooting was such a moment, because even in the queer community, there's very few spaces for queer people of color to be fully ourselves.
Yeah.
I completely agree.
Yeah. So I just imagine, like, what is it like to have these 3 hours in the week where you finally get to be yourself after all these years, and to have it be,
taken away from you.
It was just,
Yeah, I have to say, like, it kind of it got to me because I used to a place like Pulse. That was I did the same thing growing up in my 20s. Like it wasn't. I didn't go to Florida, but like I hung out in the Abbey almost every week, and I hung out at Rage almost
Rage on Friday nights.
Rage on Friday nights.
Abbey, Rage, what are those?
The Abbey is in West Hollywood, and it's a gay bar. And Rage is another gay bar in West Hollywood. And I went as a baby fag hag. That's what I called myself at the time. With all my newly out friends.
Oh my God.
I was the fun. I was the one girl in the group that they would be like, you're going to come with me. And I'm like, all right.
But for heterosexual women, it's a safe space to be at a place with music, and you can dance without any sort of fear of like being groped or harassed.
I still was groped, and that's another conversation for another day.
But isn't there? it's tangent, but isn't there also a narrative saying that like heterosexual women are taking over gay clubs, and that's
Yeah, that's
they
another-
were.
That's
They
problematic
are.
too.
It
That's
was
problematic.
Yeah, we're gonna
problematic.
have another
It's
show.
a whole nother
You
episode.
got your queer episode. Just I'll drive
I was
back here.
gonna
No, but
yeah.
it's the point is, I think these stories are stories worth getting airtime about
No,
the way
yeah.
it means to be navigating two identities. And in fact, I felt like the pulse shooting is why this book has been taking me so long to write, is because I'm like,
Did it change things?
It changed things. So I think I was writing a standard sociology book, kind of like my first book. And I just felt like when I looked at what I had written for thus far, it just didn't feel urgent enough. And so I think like my writing everyone evolves. Like my writing has become a little less academic and a little bit more politicized or I mean, I have tenure, so I don't give a fuck anymore about how I write. You can say what you want, but like it's like, why not use that privilege of tenure to write things in the tone that you want
That
instead.
means something to you.
Yeah. At the end of the day, like what's great about, I have some stuff published from that research and the greatest thing is when, I've met queer boys of color that have said like, I never knew how to think about what was going on in my life until I read that article you wrote. And I read it and I cried, and then I gave it to my mom, who wasn't accepting of me, and she read it and she cried, and then we read it together and we cried, and I'm like, there's no
Yeah.
price. There's no like
Substitute for that.
Yeah.
substitute for that moment of
Yeah.
like the written word has given someone a framework to understand the confusion
Yeah.
that's been going on in their life. So
Because as much as progress as there is, there is going to still be like that story of the fear of my parents are going to kick me out, or like
Yeah.
I have no one.
yeah, it took a long way to get to ordinary for a lot of queer parents or for a lot of queer kids. It takes a very long time to get to ordinary, because I think a lot of they know that everything they do is a reflection of their parents' immigrants' American dream, and so they don't want to fuck that up. So
So I can't wait till it gets published.
I know.
And we
You
could
can
have
come
another
back.
come back,
Yes.
have another
Yeah.
conversation about it.
Hurry up.
I'm just kidding.
No pressure.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm
No, I was
actually
just
going to be in
super
Berkeley
excited.
for a writing workshop
Oh,
for
right on.
so I'm excited about it.
Go Bears. And I'm just really excited
Yeah.
to have you on. That's why I was like, this is a great conversation, by the way. The time flew by really, really quick. So
Yeah,
I think,
and I'm so excited about this. This show is just, there's nothing like it out there.
yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. This is good.
This
So-
is Filipino American life.
Yeah.
So do you have ways people can reach you?
On the Twitter.
Yeah.
Yeah, Twitter's good at Anthony Ocampo. The
And your
Facebook
Facebook group,
page is facebook.com/Latinos of Asia. You can just search for it, and I just what I would say is, I just want Filipinos to be unapologetic about censoring their experiences in the public sphere. So come join the conversation is what I'd say.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to answer any questions
Cool.
that people have about the book via those platforms.
Cool.
Yay.
Thank you.
So much fun. And go Bears.
Appreciate
And
it.
go
Berkeley and go Cubs.
Stanford.
But we had high school, right? So
had high
go
school. Go
Cubs.
Cubs. Go Cubs.
I was like, I don't like that stupid tree.
Thank you so much for
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Cool.
Bye.
Bye.
This Filipino American Life is produced by Michael Nailat. Our intro and outro music is by Roger Habon, aka 10.4 Raj. Resident reality checker Girly Colado, legal advisor Rianne Fajardo, and graphic design by Vincent Collyer.